You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.
Welcome back to On the Way Home, the podcast where we dig into the ideas, research, and movements shaping the future of housing and community across Canada and beyond. I'm your host, Emmy Kelly. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Prentiss Dantzler, Associate Professor of Sociology and Founding Director of the Housing Justice Lab at the University of Toronto. Dr. Dantzler is one of North America's leading thinkers on neighbourhood change, racial inequities in housing, asset-based welfare, and the broader social systems that determine who gets to thrive in a community and who gets pushed out. A special thank you to Dr. Prentiss for being here today. Let's jump in. Thanks so much, Prentiss, for joining us on the way home today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Appreciate you taking the time. Here on the way home, we have a signature question that we ask each guest. What does home mean to you?
That's a great question. So for me, I think about home as more than a place you live. It's about stability. It's about the ability to stay put in place. We know for a long time, home is tied to belonging, is tied to a routine, feeling secure, not even just in your neighborhood, but your community more broadly. And I think for a lot of people listening to your show, the sense of home is increasingly becoming uncertain, right? Not just in big cities, but even small rural or smaller cities in and of themselves. There's questions about this kind of connection about, social life, and it's tied to particular places and how that shapes who we are. And so for me, home is about kind of finding out who we are and where we're at.
I love that. And for listeners who may be meeting you for the first time, can you share a bit about your journey? What led you into studying neighborhood change, housing justice, and the systems that shape how communities evolve?
Yeah, great question. So my story is pretty personal. My dad in the earlier 2000s had what we call a subprime mortgage during the Great Recession. And so as a lot of houses in the United States and around the world were having issues with absorbent amount of taxes and increased interest rates. As I was graduating undergrad, I came home to find out that my family was dealing with the same issues. And so I moved into a rental property my dad had bought in the earlier 2000s, around 2005. And partly in that situation, he found out that quickly his teaser rate of 2% on his mortgage jumped to 9%. And so as you can imagine, the mortgage rate was exponentially high at that point in time. And so originally I was more interested in environmental issues around environmental sustainability, the ways in which kind of energy costs were really big for kind of urban communities or poor communities around the country or the United States. But having this kind of personal shock made me switch my gears a little bit and getting more into the housing space. And so I started studying more about housing finance, started studying the impact of housing policies on different neighborhoods. And for me, it was a really good way to kind of understand history in and of itself, history, but also politics. And so these are not natural things that we come to think about housing markets, but they're created or socially created and constructed. And so after undergrad, having kind of switched gears, I went back to graduate school to kind of learn more about just like urban planning, public administration, and public policy. It took a more interdisciplinary approach to how we think about just urban communities and housing dynamics. And luckily, around that same time, again, a personal story, I grew up in the city of Philadelphia, which is one of our oldest U.S. cities, but has like a strong and still high mark of public housing, as we call it there, or social housing in the Canadian context and other contexts as well. And I also noticed that while I was dealing with the issues that my family was dealing with, there was a number of housing developments around the city that were just getting boarded up and torn down and redeveloped. And so as a resident, as a community member, I was just more curious about what are happening to the people and the families that were living there. What is going on between them, and why are we in this situation where a lot of people are getting or can't stay in place? They're forced to move in and of itself. And when you go to graduate school, you start to hear a lot more about the broader discourses and discussions around, poor communities or urban neighborhoods. And so for me, since then, I've been trying to understand how these dynamics have been impacting how people stay in place or their fight to stay in place.
So then can I ask you, you seem like you
Sure.
grew up in the States. How did you end up pursuing your journey also in Canada? You do both, right? Or
Yeah. So as an academic, you don't really have a ton of choices of where you can actually get jobs. The market is really hot. And so if you are not willing to move any and everywhere, you're very much limiting your job prospects. And I graduated from Rutgers University in Camden, New Jersey in 2016. I was pretty much done in 2015, but I had the opportunity to take advantage of a fellowship program, a faculty fellowship program that allowed me to teach at my first academic job, which was at Colorado College in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And so most of my life has been on the East Coast, and I'm very biased to the East Coast. So between like New York City, the DMV area, and Philly was like where I would call home, a broader home or home environment. And so Colorado was just not that. It wasn't the same type of space. It didn't have the same type of urban feel as I kind of grown accustomed to. But it also taught me about a lot of the other housing dynamics in and of itself that were happening in other places around the country. And so around that time, in around 2015, 2016, Denver and Colorado had a housing boom, a rental housing boom specifically. So rents were rising at very high paces to the point where rental rates or rent rates were higher than home ownership rates. And so you had a lot of people spending a lot of their income on rents versus home ownership. And there was another thing about HOAs. So those are another homeowners associations. There's another kind of entities in this space. And so being in Colorado allowed me to kind of round out my kind of knowledge about housing, thinking about it across different cities and across different spaces. But again, having so much social and public housing in Philadelphia, I was really curious about why we didn't keep doing that, right? And so I pursued a lot of that work in my doctoral training, thinking about the mythology of people being stuck in place and how we can kind of complicate those narratives and those dynamics and really understand why people are staying in their places long, because the social reasons weren't really connecting full-heartedly with the economic reasons or why people are moving around or not. And so as an interested, curious person, I applied for a fellowship and luckily received a Fulbright fellowship in 2019 to come to Canada at the University of Toronto in my current Department of Sociology, for like a 6-month period just to study social housing. And Toronto, the city of Toronto, was particularly interesting to me because outside of New York, it had the largest amount of social housing in North America. And I was really curious about if countries at the federal level or the national level were approaching these programs differently. What was the uniqueness about why we have so much social housing in Toronto and New York City, but less and less around some of the other major cities that we see across both countries, with some exceptions. And at the same time, I was my second job at that point was in Georgia State, in Atlanta, Georgia, where I'm at right now, visiting family members. And here there was just another situation around like the intersection between race, space, and community. And so you had a lot of kind of Black municipal leaders, a lot of Black leadership in political offices that were having really big fights with Black community organizers and activists that were fighting for housing justice. And so it really, between kind of having these experiences across Philly, Denver, Toronto, Atlanta, and now back in Toronto, my research has really kind of broadened out to think about how these housing issues are not just impacting the poorest people, they're impacting all households. And in 2021, I had the opportunity to come back to Canada full time. And since then, I've been working at the University of Toronto in the Department of Sociology. And aside from that, I'm also the faculty director of the School of Cities and the founding director of the Housing Justice Lab, which is within the School of Cities itself. And so the lab was an initiative between myself, or led by me, under the supervision of Karen Chappell, who's the ED of the School of Cities. And partly my focus has been to think about how do we use our resources, our space, our platform to really support and build capacity with some of the other nonprofit and non-governmental agencies and entities around the US and Canada to boost up their approaches to housing. And for me, I'm really interested in like alternative models or models that, have a proof of concept, but they're just not being scaled up or actually analyzed enough to see how they can draw really good insights to other spaces across the world. And so, yeah, a roundabout way to say how personal family issues with housing made me think about it a little bit more critically. And that's how I got here today.
I want to say congratulations on all your achievements, but also and especially thank you, because clearly you're very passionate and invested in advancing the space. And so I'll ask you, because much of your work explores home ownership and the ethos of ownership in North America, how has home ownership become more than just a housing choice? And what does that mean for equity and access?
Yeah, so in graduate school, there's a great article by a sociologist, Ann Schley, who was at the Georgia State University. And there was a really big push about US federal government encouraging low income households to engage in home ownership. And given my own personal experiences with my dad, trying to save a house, trying to find money to do repairs and renovations when they were needed, having to deal with, a dwindling, aging housing stock, but not enough resources to actually bring it up to date. I was always curious and questioning if that was really the best approach. And why do we keep doubling down on home ownership versus all these other ways that I know people live, right? And so we're thinking about social housing, community land trusts, co-ops, and so for me, it's the fact that we put too much emphasis or too much focus on people just owning property in and of itself. Um, so I started off in a policy space, but then I got more curious about just like the political and social dynamics. Like, why are we doing this because it's not an organic thing, but we treat it like it is. And so why does everybody want to buy a house now? What is this coming from? And then the more research you do and the more reading about the topic, you really realize that this was like a marketing campaign really created by governments to drive consumption in particular types of submarkets, one being the housing market. And so you see the story of the United States in like the earlier kind of 1930s, 1940s, encouraging home ownership, seeing how to benefit a lot of households to this day, right? So a lot of households were able to take advantage of generational wealth accumulation or building. But at the same time, that economic story is also a racialized story. And so while some communities got access to these resources, a lot of other communities didn't. And we see the kind of deleterious effects of like not having access to some of these asset-based ways that we just grow wealth and money. Um, but at the same time, these communities were, this is the community where I grew up, right? I grew up in a low income, majority Black neighborhood. Philadelphia is a majority Black city up until some of the more recent census numbers. And so in that space, it was like, it wasn't just about gaining access to better neighborhoods. It was about how people relied on their neighbors for more social support. And so I started to see this kind of direct connection between how we drive this ethos of ownership and how we kind of discount or undercut the ethos of social support that needs to be embedded within communities in and of itself. And that thinking for me has really been drawn by my graduate studies. And so my program at Rutgers was focused on community development. And it was really about thinking about community control, local control. How do neighbors and community members take control of their own spaces versus these very much top-down approaches that I would argue that we still do to this day. And so homeownership isn't just about tenure. It's treated as a marker of success and good citizenship. Those are some of the age-old studies about if you're a homeowner, you were a good citizen, and really discounting the piece about renters and people with long-standing residents in these communities who are really the backbone of a lot of it too. And I think neighborhood change for me is a way to see how kind of markets, policy, but also just like racial inequality and racism within the housing market plays out in people's everyday lives. And so I think housing felt like the place where those abstract forces become very real, but also become real very quickly for a lot of people, right? Every month you're paying a mortgage or theoretically you're paying rent. And so it's a recurring theme for me to think about how can we complicate this way of ethos where it's really thinking about is this really a choice? And is this the best approach to really think about addressing housing issues, not just for people that can buy homes, but people that can't even find a home for themselves?
And you've touched on it briefly, the racial discrimination, which you've researched extensively in the housing market. What forms of discrimination still show up today, and how do they shape where people can live and build stability?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll do some of the current studies that we've been doing in both countries, in the United States and Canada. And so recently there was a group of researchers that just published a paper and they did an audit study. So they did this kind of experiment. They put avatars on Kijiji, and Canadians are really familiar with Kijiji. US people might know as a different style like Craigslist or something like that. But they put avatars out and just had like, fake renters reaching out to landlords just to see how they were going to respond. And partly the question was a lot of us as faculty members noticed that our real estate agents, when we got up here, when we were looking for houses, were really steering us in very specific neighborhoods based on our kind of social position or our social identity. And so, some of my colleagues that are from China, they get targeted and pushed or marketed more neighborhoods that have a higher Asian population. And even looking at my realtor, who I'm really close with at this point, having done multiple things with him over the time of Toronto, he's more broader. So we had deeper conversations about that. And within this experiment, what they found is the avatar that we had, this kind of makeshift avatar for a Black renter, they were getting lower response rates from landlords, even if everything in the note was the same, right? And so if they had the same type of intention to why they want the unit, if they had the same demographic profile other than just their racial identifiers or indicators, they were getting less responsive by landlords in all different types of housing, except for communities that have very low cost housing and very little demand. And so it started to see that like Black tenants, beyond any other racialized group in this particular study, were being left out of all this conversation about thinking about access. And at the same time, you'll get a city report or a federal report that says, increases in homelessness are being driven up and exponentially getting higher year after year, with Indigenous and Black people being two of the social groups that are seeing that are bearing the brunt of those kind of realities. And so for me, it's really thinking about how we see like exclusion from the housing market translating into this overrepresentation in other forms of housing and other parts of our housing system, right? Our shelter system, our housing allowance system, even a lot of the nonprofits that I end up working with in the Toronto context, or even beyond that, a lot of them are still dealing with this. Like we have a lot of Black clients that we deal with. And so it really paints a different picture about, it's kind of multicultural space and how we think about housing practices, but also ways in which kind of policies are targeted at different communities. Some of your highest form of eviction filings are in majority Black neighborhoods. These same neighborhoods don't have the same type of social resources. And so a recent report that we're actually going to launch this week with the Somali Center for Culture and Recreation, we found that there's a lot of Black displacement around Black social institutions or cultural centers. And so if we're having all these conversations about, building more housing, it's going to drive down prices. There's another conversation about who's actually getting access to the houses when they become available. And I think partly what we see is that landlords are using preferential treatment for renters and steering them in very particular ways that are very much along the lines of racialized lens. If we just step out for a bigger second, I think there's other pieces when we think about pieces like gentrification, right? And so like very much people see it as like this kind of natural process where you have a lot of investment into lower income communities. But even when you look at some of the numbers around the city of Toronto, those are very much targeted in particular neighborhoods where have higher forms of visible minority, but particularly Black and also South Asian households. And so there's a direct relationship between like disinvestment, dispossession, and revitalization and redevelopment in the same frame. And I start to see these things as connected to a very much racialized or racist housing system where it excludes people just based on how they look.
A lot of social policy in Canada and the US functions as asset-based welfare, especially through housing. What are the consequences of tying household well-being and social mobility to property ownership?
Yeah, I have a big pet peeve that every year there's always a report that looks at the racial wealth gap, particularly in the United States. And it always has like a statistic that says how long it would take if everything just froze right now for different groups to catch up to like their white counterparts. And it's always something like there's like centuries of dates in that space. And so it's usually like 270 years for Black people to gain the same amount of wealth as white families in these spaces. So for me, I think there's a ways in which we think about how this housing strategy has functioned way more as an asset-based welfare. This is also like global changes, right? Most countries were not or stepping away from a lot of the social welfare systems or programs that they used to do back in the 60s and 70s. And even in my classes, we talk about this as like a shift in neoliberalism, where you say, well, what is the role of the government? And I think in a lot of work, my central question has been that, what is the role of government in supplying goods and services particularly in the space of housing. And once that switch happened, you have more people relying on protecting that asset base. And so one thing I always tell my students is that the probably worst two identifiers or identities that are in the way of really kind of good housing justice work, I would say, are like parents and homeowners, right? And because they're always trying to protect their assets, i.e. kids and their property, because that's the way they see kind of their long-term trajectories in and of itself. I think what we've come to this conclusion, and probably a mythology, is that owning property is expected to make up for a lot of the gaps in wages, the gaps in social supports that the government could be supplying, but also a gap in public services, because you're making people or making households rely on the equity gains that they can do for themselves without causing attention or stressing for different ways the government can approach that space. And while that does work for some, I think it leaves out many exposed to a lot more risk and a lot more exclusion as they are just trying to experience their everyday lives or live their everyday lives.
Your work looks at community organizing and reclaiming space. What are some examples of communities successfully pushing back against exclusion or displacement?
Yeah, I think this has been a big turn in my work, I think, in the last few years. It's just like, I'm really interested in how people push back against displacement, either individually or collectively. And this is anything from tenant organizing. I've already mentioned community land trusts, some cooperative models. And what I do like about them is that they're not just trying to shape the physical environment, they're also trying to shape how we think about housing, right? Are there other ways that we can live with each other that are just not purely market driven? And so for me, these efforts remind us that housing can be treated as like a shared resource and not just an investment for one's own family. And I think that's the best way to kind of do these things. I'm very inspired around a lot of the work that's going on around Canada, and especially around some of the smaller groups, whether it's land trusts like Toronto Chinatown Land Trust or Kingston Market Community Land Trust, Little Jamaica Land Trust, right? That's focused way more on commercial ownership. And so I'm really interested in how communities have always resisted, the burnt of displacement or the fear of being dispossessed or displaced from their communities. And so it's also allowed them to come up with really creative and innovative ways to resist. And that's where I think my work is shifting more into, like, exposing that as alternatives to the constant overflow of just market-driven approaches to housing.
And displacement, like as you've kind of alluded to in the conversation, doesn't impact all groups in the same way. How do displacement pressures fall unevenly on low-income households and racialized communities?
Yeah, I mean, displacement doesn't hit everybody the same way. And as you point out, lower income households and racialized communities tend to face it first and also tend to have fewer protections than the other group, right? Homeowners in and of themselves, or more wealthy neighborhoods. But I also want to stress that this loss isn't just housing, it's networks, right? The ability for people to kind of bridge networks with their neighbors. There's a history there, right? So we forget that these places were there before we got there. And so it kind of erases that particular history. And a lot of times it minimizes or dilutes community power, right? And so a lot of the federal programs or even like state level programs that I've seen in both countries usually came from some type of experiments that local communities were trying to figure out in and of themselves, and then they just got scaled up. And I think that's where the beauty is, where we think about policy, is that big policies, like national policies, usually have some type of local experiment or some type of local case study that they're drawing insights from. And I think that's where I find a lot of this ways in which kind of displacement isn't evenly felt. But the resistance that comes out of that also gives kind of beauty and space to think differently about how to go forward.
With all these dynamics in mind, ownership, discrimination, and displacement, what structural changes do you think would move us closer to true housing justice?
Yeah, the two big things that I've been focusing on and advocating for is just stronger tenant protections, but also a stronger focus on non-market housing. And I don't even like to call it non-market because it's all within the same market. They still have to abide by similar zoning codes, planning rules, and regulations, but decommodified housing, right? Where you're not just looking housing to grow wealth. And this came up at a recent debate I had with a couple people sponsored by ULI. And the ED of Canadian Urban Institute asked me this. She was like, so what are people supposed to, if they can't buy a home, where are they supposed to shoot for? And I'm like, well, I'd rather shoot for all the other things in my life that I probably can have access to. And I would rather push my government to supply me with the basic needs that I would need, right? And so I don't want people to all have to figure out how to buy a home. I don't think it's a competitive space. And I don't think that gives us the true kind of freedom or liberation in that space. And so a bigger focus on non-market housing where people have the ability to stay in their communities long-term, take advantages of the networks and the ability to build bridges with other people around them, the ability to kind of discuss issues as they arise, but also feel like they have a stake in a game. I think that's the biggest piece for me. But also just thinking about tenant protections, like as we're just building a lot of housing, and we've had this kind of discourse in Canadian context, but it's increasingly becoming more vivid in the US space as well. What happens while we're building, right? We know housing takes a while to get online. What happens in the meantime? And so it doesn't do us good service to keep talking about building housing without thinking about people that may be pushed out their communities while this housing is being built. And just from an economic and policy standpoint, these people will flow into other aspects of the housing system, whether we're talking about shelters or people experiencing homelessness. And so for me, it has to be about equity. And it has to be continuously questioning the idea about ownership as the main push to stability. And so, yeah, tenant protections and decommodified or non-market housing.
Before we come to our last question, I do want to kind of open the floor. You're clearly an expert in this space, and you do so much research, and you study it, and you advocate for it, and you have experience across North America. Is there anything else that you would want to share with our listeners that you haven't yet gotten to dive into, or anything you want to highlight, or anything listeners can do in the housing space to take action, whether they're a service provider or a lived expert, or just anything else that you want to share while we have you?
Yeah. About 12 years ago, it's around times 2026 now. So about 12 years ago, in a lot of the policy circles, and even till today, the idea is that we always need evidence-based policy to just do good public policy. What I found out is that, yes, that does hold true ideally, but a lot of the ways that we do housing policy is literally politically motivated or politically based. And so we know that it's not about home ownership. It's really about people having residential stability in their spaces that really gives them all the benefits that the same homeowner would have, aside from just accumulating capital through their home equity gains. And so for the listeners, I really want them to think about why they bought their homes, or why they want to buy a home. Two, if there are other alternatives, why wouldn't you explore those that seem to be, less of an obstacle or less of a burden to actually engage in that space? And three, how does this also fit in a broader narrative or conversation about how we just think about, our individual space in the Canadian context or in the US context, where there are longstanding, communities in place, but also Indigenous communities in and of themselves. And so what does it mean to constantly promote this idea of home ownership on stolen land? What does it mean to think about home ownership as a way to allow Indigenous communities or Indigenous peoples to negotiate in terms of reconciliation with even the Canadian federal government? And so for me, I would like to kind of decouple wealth accumulation for housing policy. And for a lot of people, that's not a good idea, or they're scared of that idea about what the actual implications of. But if you didn't need to worry about wealth, how much would you live differently? How much would you change your life to not worry about focus on your home, but also focus on all the other things that we say we need as, humans? I think lastly, in terms of like me as an academic, this space has been very exciting because Canada just doesn't have enough research on housing outside of like government entities or nonprofit agencies or research institutes. And so we draw a lot from the US context, even though there's a different politics there, there's a different history there, there's a different kind of ideological understanding of like what an American is versus what a Canadian is, and like the ideologies that they hold on to. And so I would also allow people to kind of really engage with some of the ongoing scholarship and work that's being done to really kind of broaden our scope in the Canadian context. And so there's kind of two entities I would like to bring up. One, I'm part of a group called the New Housing Alternatives, and this was based off a partnership grant with SHIRK, led by Alan Walks and Sue Bunce at the University of Toronto in geography and planning. And what this group does is look at various different ways that we can create a whole new housing system. Like, what would a completely new housing system look like? And while ownership may have a role in that, what does a more holistic housing system look like that thinks about how do you not just think about people being in place, but what are the decision-making processes that they can engage in to reshape their communities outside of just screaming at their MP or going down to City Hall or writing an op-ed. I also think about just how we think about data, right? And so like we're really pushing for data justice because a lot of the ways that we don't know about our housing system is based on really weird privacy and secrecy laws in Canada around data access. And so can we learn something from working with Indigenous partners around data sovereignty that allows us to draw more critical insights about what our housing market is and isn't doing? And lastly, just like think about why do you want to protect these assets? And what would it mean if you lost your house tomorrow? And be gracious and critical of that. A lot of people that we see living on the street or that are very much housing insecure, that's still somebody's family member, that's still somebody's neighbor, that's still somebody's community member. And I would really push us to think about how could we use our positions to serve, those in need, but also draw this insights that if your equity gains are going down or your wealth is being kind of attacked, there's other ways to live out your life that may not be to be in pure competition with your neighbor. And so for me, yeah, it's about kind of thinking more holistically that housing drives not just how we live around each other, but a different take on how we should live around each other. And that's where I hope my work tends to bring some insights into that space.
Thanks, Prentiss. I have a little peanut here. Scratch. You should go outside.
No problem.
When you look at the growing interest in housing justice across cities, what gives you hope about where this movement is headed?
Yeah, I've been excited to be in Canada because I was really getting a little let down and like frustrated in the US around some of these conversations. Because the focus, to your point in the earlier part, is that a lot of it is just focused on homeownership. It's continuously focused on homeownership. And our conversation about public housing is pretty voided at this point, up until some recent organizing efforts in the United States. And so I think I'm inspired and excited about where these conversations can go and what they'll actually lead to. We've been talking a lot more about building non-market housing in the Canadian context, and with the introduction of Build Canada Homes more recently, I think there's some space to see some insights and some relief coming from that particular sector. But also it's becoming more of a common language around housing actors to say, oh, we need affordable housing. We need non-market. It's kind of laughable that it's at such a low level compared to the rest of our housing system. I think the other piece to kind of think about is that it's given me a lot of hope that countries are just learning from each other. And so even in the Canadian context, we're constantly talking about what the US does in their housing market, but they're doing the same now in and of itself. Now, there might be other reasons why there's a lot more geopolitical conversations going on between the US and other countries, but I do think there's a lot of room for people to kind of engage in this work. And I've seen that firsthand with some of the community land trust groups that I've seen across Canada that are doing tours and doing workshops with other community land trusts in the United States to learn about best practices, what work, what doesn't, obstacles, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And so I'm excited because a lot more people are imagining different alternatives for the future. And while we're trying to be stuck in the present or get through the day to day, I do have an eye towards what's next, and a curiosity about what's next in the system. The last piece I would probably leave people with is that the focus on housing justice is also a focus on economic justice. It's also a focus on racial justice. It's also a focus on how we think about gender justice, data justice. And so when we think about justice, it's not just about exploring all the ways in which the system recorrects itself or tends to reproduce different types of inequalities. It's also thinking about these kind of movements are intersecting with each other to round out a different way of living. And I'm really inspired about not just thinking about housing as like, a tool of asset wealth creation or a tool of finance, but also a marker of social status, right? Ways in which people claim ties and think about the emotive feelings that the experiences they have living with their family members or having different events. And so my grandmother passed about a decade ago at this point, but even when I go to her house, when I go back to Philly, I still call that Nana's house. And it's not just a physical space, but it embodies some type of feelings and emotions about, our own biographical histories and that. And so, yeah, I think for me, it's really thinking about how the future of housing justice is not just about just building more affordable housing, but it's also requiring us to think about a different way to live around and with each other.
Thank you, Prentiss. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today and for all your insights and for all your work that you're putting in for the sector. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much. No, thank you. Thank you for having me, and it's great to be here.
Take care.
You too.
Today's episode featured Dr. Prentiss Dantzler, Associate Professor of Sociology and Founding Director of the Housing Justice Lab at the University of Toronto. His research and insights illuminate the structural forces shaping housing justice, housing access, neighborhood change and displacement, and the deep inequities embedded in North America's housing systems. His work continues to challenge policymakers, practitioners, and communities to rethink the role of housing in building a just society. Thank you for joining On the Way Home for this powerful conversation. I'm your host, Emmy Kelly, and this podcast is brought to you by Blue Door.
You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Emmy Kelly.